Looking for an emulation device? Why not an old smartphone? A couple weeks ago, I discussed the virtues of using a smartphone as an emulator versus grabbing a new dedicated handheld. There's a ton of nuance to that discussion, but one of the main drawbacks to using a smartphone over a handheld tends to be that it's just a tiny bit harder to set up. On the bright side, that difficulty is mainly true for anyone brand new to the space. That's why, in this video, I'm going to provide some general info for new folks to get their phones up and running. I'll go through the steps of choosing the right hardware, the basics of setting up an emulator, and installing a front end to make everything a bit easier to use. If you already have a phone or preferred front end, feel free to use the video chapters to skip around. This is a guide for y'all after all. Use it how you need it. First up, some necessary caveats, with the biggest being that I'm going to ignore iOS for this entire video. iOS-equipped phones are generally more than capable for emulation, and the tools do exist to enable you to emulate most systems available on other devices. However, Apple's App Store guidelines and awkward sideloading capabilities make it a more involved task than it needs to be. It's possible I'll get into all that in a future video if I ever decide to buy an iPhone newer than the 7 currently in my phone collection, but for today, we're pretending like Android is the only OS that exists. Sorry, Windows Mobile. Additionally, this is not a video on where to find ROMs. My general stance is that the best way to get ROMs is to dump them yourself from the physical or digital copies of the games you personally have acquired, which also happens to be the most legal way available. Even beyond the potential illegality of pointing you toward a website that will lead you to find various ROMs for various systems, I'm not going to endorse any specific website since this video will be online for many years and I don't know the future status of any of those sites. If you're interested, I will have a few links in the video description to the videos I've made in the past on how to dump games from various systems. There are only a few right now, but I'm hoping to add a lot more in the near future. With all that out of the way, let's start from the top with which phone you should actually buy. Now, if you already have an old phone lying around or want to use your primary device for emulation, it's an easy decision. Just use that. Unless you're looking for a new project to work on, or the devices you have are more than, let's say, 4 or 5 years old at this point. Whatever you have on hand is always going to be your best starting point. From my experience, anything with the Snapdragon 855 chipset or better, meaning flagship smartphones from 2019 and beyond, will perform well for just about all the modern emulators available. Anything prior to 2019 or less powerful than an 855 is still going to perform well for certain systems. For example, I have an Xperia Play from 2011 that plays SNES, Game Boy Advance, and N64 games just fine. You just might not have great performance emulating more demanding systems like PS2, GameCube, and Vita, depending on your chipset. For reference, here's a table of some phones with various processors pulled from my collection and which systems they can play without too much fuss. As you can see, even older phones perform well, just not as well as some of the newer phones. One more thing to consider for older phones. The older the phone you buy, the greater the chance that you'll need to perform some sort of maintenance on the device after buying it, like swapping out the battery, doing some heavy cleaning, or covering up scratches. That's not even to mention how many older phones no longer get security updates or are stuck on much older versions of Android. Phones that are 3 to 4 years old right now can already be found for prices as low as $100 to $200 in good condition. Some even older phones can be found for slightly under $100, but that's typically the floor for anything not damaged and worthwhile for emulation. So if opting for something even older, you'd likely be giving up better performance and newer materials for the sake of saving only a little money. Which, hey, that might be worthwhile to you, especially if you have a phone in mind with a unique form factor. I personally really enjoy the Red Hydrogen 1 and ZTE Axon M phones from 2018 because their form factors are cool while still doing most things I'd want to do with them. Whatever you do, work within your own budget and never strain your finances for the sake of buying something like a new smartphone. The spirit of this entire guide is to use what's available and keep capable devices out of landfills, not to drain your savings. Also, if you're new to shopping for secondhand electronics, eBay is typically a great starting point for actually finding a phone. It's where all the prices mentioned in this video come from, and typically where prices for the devices in other marketplaces are set. If you're not a fan of eBay for one reason or another, I've seen plenty of good deals pop up on Facebook Marketplace, Goodwill, or even yard sales. With older devices, folks are just looking to offload. Secondhand electronic shops like CEX can also be a great place to get your hands on the device before you buy it to make sure it works. Wherever you buy from, just make sure there's a return policy in place if you're spending more money than you would be comfortable just throwing away if the device is unusable. As for a specific phone recommendation, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you might know I'm partial to the Surface Duo 1. It sits perfectly in a clip-on controller. It has two really nice 4x3 displays, either of which is great for older consoles, and the Snapdragon 855 inside can handle systems through GameCube and Wii without an issue. It's also only outclassed by the more expensive Surface Duo 2 as the best DS emulator I know of, due to both its solid dual-screen form factor and the fact that it's literally the size of a 3DS XL. If all that sounds good to you, I couldn't recommend it enough, especially since the minor software issues lingering with the Surface Duo line only really become bothersome when using them as primary devices for a long time. For the sake of this video, let's go with a more average-looking single-screen device that's easier to find, like the Galaxy S20 Plus. You can buy one of these online right now for less than $200, maybe even a little less if you opt for one with some cosmetic damage. Mine has some cracked glass on the back, which I covered up with a fancy sticker from dbrand. It still feels great to hold and is unnoticeable if I'm not using touch controls. If you're going this route, just make sure to buy one with a Snapdragon 865 instead of an Exynos chip. There are some real battery and performance differences between the two, and you want to opt for the one with the better chipset if you can. Other than that, the rest is typical Samsung flagship quality. A great AMOLED display with slightly curved edges, all-day battery life, at least when it was new, access to Samsung DeX if you want to play an emulator on a big screen, and this was even the final model from them to come with expandable storage via a microSD card. After you've secured a phone, think about the controller you want to use. If you want to use whatever controller you have on hand, phone clips are plentiful for the most common controllers. I got these Xbox and PS4 controller clips off Amazon a while ago. I'll leave affiliate links to both in the description, along with some additional clips for Switch and DualSense controllers. They're not fancy, but they get the job done. Companies like 8BitDo also sell full controllers with mounts on them if you'd rather have everything integrated into one package. Though I honestly think most people will have a better time with clip-on controllers, aka controllers that strap onto the sides of the phone rather than mount them. They tend to be more compact and offer an experience more like a traditional handheld console. As an example, the Bluetooth GameSir X2 is my go-to with any device that is a bit thicker or has an offsite USB-C port. For more standard devices, a USB-C model is also available, and I've seen a ton of people swear it has improved input latency. Of course, those aren't your only options. There are a wide variety of these sorts of devices on the market if you just do a little shopping around. For example, during this video, I'll be using the first generation Razer Kishi. It's not a perfect controller, with the buttons feeling just a tad bit small and stiff, but I like the look and security of it with something like the Galaxy S20 Plus. You can also grab one of these first-gen controllers for about $30 to $45 these days, which is more than worth it. Just make sure you're getting one with a USB-C connector instead of a Lightning port, or you're gonna have a bad time. Razer does have a second generation version of this controller that fits a wider variety of phones and has some general improvements to its design which borrow from the also stellar Backbone controllers. However, that one only came out last year and will still cost you around $95 full price, unless you can find it on sale somewhere. If it's in your budget, I say go for it. If not, it's not going to make a huge difference when working with these older phones. Still, I'll have affiliate links to all of this down in the video description if you don't feel like browsing for yourself. Now that we've got the hardware squared away, let's talk emulators. For those fresh to the scene, emulators are the pieces of software that allow you to play all your backed up games, aka ROMs. Your goal will be to think through all the systems you actually want to play and download emulators to cover all of them. In general, here's a reference table for recommended emulators for each system as of this video going live, and whether you should download them directly from the store or from their official website. While it might seem wonky at first, download location can be a key factor to consider when sourcing emulators. Some emulators like Aether SX2 and Retroarch are updated as necessary through the Play Store. However, going to the websites of other emulators like Citra and Dolphin tends to be preferable since they only have out-of-date versions of their apps available through the Play Store. Others still, like Vita 3K, are only available through their websites. Unless you see a fresh link posted on their website to the Play Store, don't download anything with the same name from the Play Store. Additionally, be critical of the apps you choose to download and try to only stick with emulators that are recommended by other people. There are a lot of apps on the Play Store that claim to emulate certain consoles, but are essentially scams. This is especially true for anything claiming to emulate non-Nintendo home consoles that came out after the Xbox 360. Also, if you don't see other folks mentioning a specific emulator in general, there's a good chance there's a better option available, and that's why no one's talking about it. By the way, note that all this emulator setup can be done on your phone, no secondary PC needed. Although, if this is your first time installing a .apk file on your phone, you may get a pop-up message asking you to update your settings to allow you to do that. Go ahead and do it, it's completely safe, and these apps are pretty much trustworthy at this point. After you've moved your ROMs to your phone in a location that's easy to access, and installed all your emulators, you'll need to complete an initial setup for each emulator. Essentially, you'll need to open them one by one, direct the emulator toward the folder containing your ROMs for each system respectively, and probably set up your controller in the app's input settings. Some apps will automatically detect a controller and populate input details for you, but it's not always a given, and apps like Dolphin will almost certainly require you to do it manually. Generally, this step is about as simple as finding the input configuration settings, tapping each input, and pressing a button on your controller to reflect how you want the inputs mapped. Within the settings of most apps, you'll also find a wide variety of ways to tweak resolution and a bunch of other graphic settings. Messing around here is half the battle in getting the best performance possible, but I know it can be overwhelming for folks looking at it for the first time. In general, there are only 3 common graphic settings you'll want to tweak to start out with. Number 1, aspect ratio. For older consoles like GameCube, you may want to force a 4:3 aspect ratio to prevent the game from looking stretched. Some emulators may have widescreen patches available to allow for wider gameplay without distorting the image, but those can be fairly hit or miss depending on the game and the system. Number 2, graphics APIs. Typically, you'll have the options of either software, OpenGL, or Vulkan. Whenever possible, select Vulkan to get better performance. Vulkan is a common graphics API which tends to be lighter weight and requires less processing power for devices to run well. And 3, internal resolution. This will be a multiplier applied to the game's resolution based on the original output resolution of the console. Essentially, a higher multiplier will make the game look a lot better on a modern display, but it'll also require more processing power from your phone. I'd recommend selecting the option equal to the resolution of your phone's display to start. You'll essentially want to launch a game, see how well it feels to play, and then tweak your resolution settings further. If the game's playing poorly, decrease your resolution and try again. If your game's running well, increase your resolution until you see a performance drop. During this stage of tweaking, many apps might have performance overlays available to give some quantitative measurement regarding app performance. I'd recommend enabling it if you see it. Just remember to disable the overlay when your settings are tuned to your liking. If you don't, there's a good chance constantly having those performance metrics visible will magnify the perception of small fluctuations in performance you otherwise wouldn't have noticed. there are a ton more options in each app settings that you could tweak to change how your games run, but don't worry about knowing what they all do for right now. You'll typically only be messing with those extra options when you have a specific use case you're targeting. If you ever have any trouble figuring any of this out, remember that the best thing you can do is to not panic. Carefully read the text in the settings and ask questions when in doubt. You can leave a comment on this video or try looking for info in one of the various online emulation communities like the Emulation for Android subreddit. If you're experiencing an issue, it's very likely someone else has faced the same issue in the past. It's never a bad idea to ask for help. Something to keep in mind while setting all this up is that some phones just may not run certain emulators well. There are a ton of contributing factors which could impact the quality of emulation, but ultimately, it's worthwhile to realize that some things just don't work sometimes, especially if you're using a lower powered device. Luckily, if you run into a roadblock, you do have some options available before just giving up. The first thing I'd recommend is to check the emulator's compatibility list. For most emulators, their websites will have a list of games categorized by how well they're known to run on the current version of the emulator. If you're attempting to play a game that's marked as having some issues, the fault is likely with the emulator, not your phone. You might need to wait for a future update to the emulator to actually just fix the issue. The second option you have is to look for forks, aka altered versions of the base app. Apps like Dolphin and Citra both have MMJ forks, which have been created to squeeze just a tiny bit of better performance out of lower-end devices. If the base apps aren't working well for you, giving these differently optimized forks a shot might be worthwhile. Next up, let's talk Retroarch. When you inevitably get to Retroarch in your setup, things will be a bit different because Retroarch is an app that supplies general coverage of over a dozen systems. All you'll really need to worry about here is installing cores. Essentially, code folks have written to run games from different systems. Each system typically has a few different cores associated with it, and here are my recommendations on what to install for the systems I play. When you want to play a game, you'll load both the core and the ROM to actually load the game. From there, everything should play just fine. If you're using a standard controller, Retroarch should automatically detect and set up your input configuration according to the controller. If not, you'll want to take a trip to the settings and set up the configuration manually as you did for other emulators. Additionally, if Retroarch launches with touch overlays enabled while you have a controller attached, you can disable that in the settings as well. Again, if you have any issues whatsoever, take a look into the settings and then ask questions if there's anything you don't understand. As a piece of software, Retroarch can be as complex as you want it to be, with many more features than I have ever needed to use. I'll leave a link to a more in-depth Retroarch guide in the video description if you want to delve further. Once all your emulators have been tested and set up to your liking, you could honestly stop right there and have a great time. You technically don't need anything else, just launch the games from your emulators directly and have fun. But let's make everything a bit simpler by taking it one step further and installing a front end. For anyone unfamiliar, a front end is basically a purpose-built piece of software that allows you to bypass the Android interface altogether to launch specific games without needing to open a specific emulator. Typically, they're also very controller friendly, which is great if you don't want to constantly take your hands off a controller to touch your phone. There are more than a few options to choose from. Retroarch itself can be used as a sort of front end with a bit of tinkering if your primary interest is only playing the games available within Retroarch. Going for something a bit more generalized would be my recommendation though. One of the cleanest front ends available right now is called Daijisho, which can be installed directly from the Play Store. Opening it for the first time will install some extra data and prompt you to download additional platforms. All you need to do is select the systems you have ROMs for and tap Import. After a small delay, you'll see a number of cards pop up named after each system. These are essentially folders which will house all of the links to your various ROMs and point your emulators in the right direction. To add those ROMs, You'll just want to tap the path button for each system and add a path to your phone's file storage where you've saved all of your ROMs. And then just select Sync. As long as that path you selected has ROMs relevant to your system, you should see the games start to populate. From here, you can essentially tap into your library, select the game, and it should start running as expected. Although, note that if the path you indicated in Daijisho differs from the path you included in your standalone emulator, you may get an error message asking you to re-specify your path in the emulator. Retroarch is the main exception here, likely because of how flexible the software tends to be. Also, for some reason, Daijisho doesn't work well with Aether SX2. Not sure why, the app still acts as a decent shortcut to launch games and whatnot, but you'll need to either tap the game you want to play twice or set up Aether SX2 as an app shortcut. Both will do the same thing. If you find that Daijisho isn't launching your games correctly, tap the pencil icon for that system and check your default player settings. If there's an emulator mentioned as default that you don't have downloaded, you should consider downloading it. Alternatively, you can tap the drop-down menu and point Daijisho toward a different emulator that you do have installed. There are a ton of small customizations like that you can make in the app itself. Honestly, I could probably do a full 30-minute video just on everything available in Daijisho, but I think it's worthwhile for you to just tap through the settings yourself and see what's available. Most settings you probably won't need to mess with to play your games. Although, pro tip, you can download neat wallpaper packs in the settings menu if you don't like the default images. I went with a minimalist pack and I really dig it. Of the settings to actually consider though, at least if you're planning to use your phone purely as a gaming device, I'd recommend going to your phone settings to change your launcher to Daijisho. That way, whenever you power on your phone, it'll automatically run Daijisho, eliminating an extra tap and shaving off quite a bit of time between pressing your power button and playing your game. Now, if Daijisho isn't your cup of tea, there are other options out there that you can pull from. The one I have the most experience with is called Dig, again available through the App Store. Dig is a bit more straight to the point than Daijisho when it comes to launching a game. It also has support for various themes which radically change the appearance and usability of the app. If you're really into tinkering or hunting for a very specific look for your front end, Dig might be up your alley. As one other alternative, you could also just use a simplified launcher instead, like Niagara launcher. While you're giving up some speed to launch a game, having a simplified default launcher might work well for folks who plan to use their phone for something other than gaming. For example, while I've been showing my Galaxy S20 Plus with Daijisho enabled, I also use this phone to manage my TikTok account and make any standard aspect ratio screen recordings for videos. Neither of which is really comfortable to use with Daijisho as the launcher. Instead, I have Niagara launcher enabled for a clean look with an easy shortcut to Daijisho in the corner when I need it to play games. But yeah, once you figured out your launcher and app settings, you're pretty much done. Congrats! You have a really capable, functional handheld console. All that's left to do is to start playing some games. Now, to close out, some final thoughts from someone who spent way too much time messing with emulation over the years. Number one, often the form factor of a phone can be one of the most critical things to consider for gameplay experience. Phones with large displays are great until they don't fit into controller clips. Likewise, dual screen or folding phones can offer really unique gameplay, but might require some extra consideration for controllers or how apps interact with the phone itself. When choosing the right hardware or eyeing an upgrade, it's worthwhile to consider the practicality of how you'll use the device as much as the raw performance of the device itself. Number two, don't be afraid of touch controls, especially if you don't have the budget for an additional controller at the moment. As a rule of thumb, touch controls tend to be less practical for games that rely heavily on shoulder and trigger buttons. However, if you just want to play pre-PS1 era games, visual novels, or turn-based RPGs, touch controls are perfectly fine. I played through the entirety of Pokemon Black on my Surface Duo using only touch controls, and I had no complaints. Then number three, spending more on hardware isn't always necessary. As I said toward the beginning, 4-year-old phones can play some of the most demanding systems out there already. Spending more money for newer phones tends to have diminishing returns for actual performance. Until Android emulation starts to break into the realm of like Xbox 360 and PS3 games, you probably don't need bleeding edge hardware to have a good time. Those are my thoughts though. I'd love to know yours. Are you new to Android emulation and have some additional questions? Are you an emulation old-timer with suggestions for new folks? Let me know down in the comments. Also, if you found this video helpful or informative, go ahead and give it a like, then get subscribed so that you don't miss out on more emulation videos in the future. In particular, I'm currently working on a script for a PlayStation TV video that's gonna be pretty interesting. The entire video is kind of just like, wow, Sony, you kind of dropped the ball on something. Please don't do it again, but you're gonna do it again because the PlayStation Q exists. Whatever. Anyway, that's gonna be all for this video. Until next time, catch you later.